Hello there y'all, I'm Space Robot 1 back with another video, and today we are going to be discussing the Latin Empire. Latin Empire is a medieval state that not too many people are familiar with, which is why I'll be covering it today. So to understand the Latin Empire, you first have to understand the Fourth Crusade, because the Fourth Crusade is the military campaign that caused the Latin Empire to come into being. So the Fourth Crusade, like a lot of the other crusades, began with the goal of retaking Jerusalem for the Catholic Church, as it had previously, they had captured it once originally and then it fell. Most of the crusading forces on this crusade were coming from Northern Europe, Italy, this general western region. But what made it different than the other crusades at the onset was the crusading army was going to travel by sea through the Mediterranean, not the traditional overland route of going through Hungary, through the Balkans, and then through Anatolia to get to the Levant. So in medieval times, if you wanted a very large fleet, and of course they need a very large fleet to transport this whole crusading army across the sea, you went to either Venice or Genoa. And the Crusaders ended up choosing to go to Venice to get their giant fleet. And Venice was able to make the large crusading fleet, but the Crusaders weren't actually able to pay for it. So the Venetians basically offered them a deal by which they would do work for the Venetians and fight their enemies, because of course this is a large army. In exchange, the Venetians would give them their big fleet so they could travel to Jerusalem and fulfill their crusading vows. So what this resulted in is the crusading army sacking the city of Zara, which was here in Dalmatia, for the Venetians. But this was a Catholic city, so this ended up enraging the papacy in Rome. So the Pope isn't just going to allow a crusading army to be used in this way, because of course this is an army formed with a specific purpose to go to Jerusalem, and he obviously its purpose was not for the Venetians to use them to fight their own campaigns in Dalmatia. So what happens is the Pope ends up excommunicating the crusading force, which basically means they were excluded from the Catholic Church. This was a really big deal, of course, due to the massive societal influence of the Catholic Church in Western Europe at this period. It's also important to note at this juncture that not all of the Fourth Crusading force was going from Venice. Some were trying to go from French ports, Genoa, Flanders. There wasn't a universal agreement, but a lot of them were trying to leave to the Holy Land through Venice. But there wasn't really one agreed upon route of how they were exactly going to get from Western Europe to the Holy Land. So despite the fact the Crusaders were now excommunicated, they still intended to make it to Jerusalem to fulfill their crusading vow. One of the Crusader leaders, by the name of Boniface of Montferrat, then ends up, in order to help them get to Jerusalem, he makes a deal with the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor. The Byzantines are, of course, a mostly Greek-speaking empire that's Eastern Orthodox, located around this area, modern Greece, parts of Anatolia, modern Turkey, that sort of area. He makes a deal with the son of a deposed emperor that if he restores the deposed emperor to the throne, he will receive transport to Egypt, which would allow them, to go on their crusade to Jerusalem, and Byzantine troops to help on his crusade, among some other privileges. So he agrees, and the Crusaders, the Venetian crusading force, makes a stop at Corfu, which is this little island here, and then goes on to Constantinople to restore the deposed emperor, and hold up their part of the agreement. So there's a lot of Byzantine internal politics that went on here. The Crusaders did manage to restore the deposed emperor, but long story short, and I'm not going to get into all the details since we're talking about the Latin Empire here, not the Fourth Crusade overall, they never got paid, so they just kind of stayed in Constantinople until they got paid, and which never occurred. But the citizens of Constantinople didn't like having all these random crusaders living in their city. Tensions eventually escalated. This resulted in the city of Constantinople being sacked by the Crusaders, which itself kind of led to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire. So these Crusaders, they now had the city of Constantinople, which was, it was this huge, gigantic city by the standards of the time, and they just had control of it. And they knew they should establish like a Latin Catholic state, so that's what they decided to do, and that's how the Latin Empire was born. the Crusaders decided to elect Baldwin of Flanders as Emperor Baldwin I of the Latin Empire, much to the chagrin of the previously mentioned Boniface of Montferrat, and that was how basically the Latin Empire came to being. So now we have to talk about sort of what it was, like how did it function, and its situation and why ultimately it isn't here today. So the Latin Empire was a feudal monarchy. The Byzantine Empire wasn't truly a feudal state, like it had feudal characteristics, but it wasn't the same as sort of Western European feudalism. But the Latin Empire had a lot more West European feudal characteristics. Modern-day Greece was divided up into kingdoms, principalities, and duchies that all had, they were technically vassals of the emperor, but they didn't actually, like, the bonds weren't that strong, so they had a high degree of autonomy. For example, the Kingdom of Thessalonica had a high degree of autonomy, Duchy of Athens. So it was a very decentralized regime as compared to the Byzantine Empire. So then when it comes to the sort of diplomatic situation, the Latin Empires was not a good one. It, of course, had a bunch of disloyal vassal states in Greece, as we talked about, which wasn't good for it. And it was surrounded by enemies. It was enemies with the Bulgarians to the north, with the Despotate of Epirus, which was sort of a Byzantine successor state, to its west. To the east, it also had an enemy in the Empire of Nicaea, which was actually the main Byzantine successor state that would eventually go on to defeat the Latin Empire and restore the Byzantine Empire. Additionally, there was one other Byzantine successor state, the Empire of Trebizond, which was over here. But there was, I'd say, generally less fighting between Trebizond and the Latin Empire, as opposed to the Latin Empire and Nicaea, Epirus, and Bulgaria. But basically what it comes down to is this is a country surrounded by enemies. Most of the countries that had friendly relations to it were over here in Western Europe, and when you're surrounded by enemies, distant allies are only so helpful. So now for a basic historical overview of the empire. So it existed from 1204, which was when the Crusaders first sacked Constantinople, until 1261, when the Empire of Nicaea, which was the Byzantine rump state, recaptured Constantinople and restored the Byzantine Empire. Although there were vassal lords of the Latin Empire that stayed in Greece later. The Latin Empire had two ruling houses. First, under Baldwin I and his son, you had the House of Flanders. Later, you had the House of Courtenay. It also had a regency period where it didn't really have an emperor. It fought as I mentioned before, it's those main enemies around it, which were pretty much everything around it for most of its history. It was also always fighting against its own rebellious vassal states in Greece. So basically, it was an empire in pretty constant decline for the most part. Near its end, it also suffered financial ruin and had to make its money begging at Western European courts for money to continue the sort of Latin presence in that area of the world. And they ended up having to sell holy relics that the last emperor Baldwin II of the House of Courtenay possessed. The empire had titular claimants in the west after it fell for quite some time. However, they didn't really have much of an impact or an effect on anything. The main historical legacies of the empire were that it contributed to the collapse of the Byzantine Empire, which would collapse about 200 years later, but it never fully recovered from the Latin imperial sort of occupation of their core territories, when the Latin Empire was the ruling power there. And also it changed the nature of Holy Roman and Byzantine relations, because of course you have a period with no one recognized Orthodox claimant to the throne, because both the Nicene and Trebizond emperors claimed the title. Overall, if I had to summarize what the Latin Empire was, it was a crusader state occupying the core land of the Byzantine Empire, and that's about basically what it was. There is a 50 subscriber special coming, so stay tuned for that. So just stay tuned for that. There might be another video coming soon. All in all, I hope you liked the video. If you have anything to say about the Latin Empire, please comment it below.